Good morning, everyone. My name is Jess Lewis. I am the program supervisor for the Homeless Student Stability Program at OSPI.
And I'm Lisa Ireland. I'm with the Student Information Office at OSPI.
Today, we're going to talk with you about unaccompanied homeless youth data collection and let you know kind of who qualifies, who you need to code for data quality purposes, and then how to navigate CEDARS so that you can know that you're doing it correctly. So under McKinney-Vento, children and youth who lack a regular, fixed, and adequate nighttime residence are eligible for McKinney-Vento services. So your district has a homeless liaison. If you're not it, please find out who that is. And these students qualify under very specific circumstances in your district. So the majority of our kids, 76%, of students in Washington State are sharing the housing of others due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or a similar reason. A similar reason is anything from a student running away to domestic violence to really kind of it's a very broad category. If there are questions about what a similar reason might be, it's always helpful to go back to, is the housing fixed, regular, and adequate? They're living in motels, hotels, trailer parks, or campgrounds, and that's because they're lacking other alternative adequate accommodation. So basically what that means is you may have a family or a youth who is living in a fifth wheel or a camper on somebody's property, right? And oftentimes we hear things like, well, they're kind of choosing to live there. But the question becomes, if they weren't there, where else would they be? And you can ask that same question around families who are doubled up, right? So sometimes there are questions about, well, is this because it's convenient or because it's cheaper, or is this really because of economic hardship? And really you want to go back to, if they weren't there, where would they be? And did they lose their housing for one of those reasons? They're living in emergency or transitional shelters. That's 14% of all of our 40,000 identified homeless students. Youth shelters are few and far between. Most shelter is geared towards families with young children, and so it's pretty rare to see actually youth between the ages of 12 and 20 really in emergency or transitional shelters. They're living in public or private places not designed for living. So this is kind of this stereotypical situation you might think of. So maybe you have a kid who's sleeping on a park bench. My kids used to sleep under the park bench because that was safer. They're camping long-term, or they're living in cars, parks, abandoned buildings, substandard housing, train stations, or similar settings. And so these are the kids who, if you talk with unaccompanied youth much, you hear kids talk about how thankful they were that they had a car to sleep in. They're sleeping in abandoned buildings. Substandard housing is really based on how what the standard is in your particular community. So a good example of this is if you have a family living in migrant housing, for example, and there's no running water, or they're living in a trailer park. So, and that's relatively, I say relatively stationary because they're living in a trailer park. The trailer isn't intended to move, but perhaps they have busted out windows or no electricity or excessive mold. Those things could qualify the family under the substandard housing standard. So today we're talking about two particular populations. So unaccompanied children or youth is a child or youth who's not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian. And you'll see on the slide that it doesn't matter how old that student is. So for example, I had 6 and 7-year-old boys who were staying with me, and I didn't know how long they were going to be there. Their housing was not fixed or regular. I like to think it was adequate, but it was a surprise to have them. The 6 and 7-year-old boys, because I was not their parent or guardian, were considered unaccompanied. Um, then we have unaccompanied homeless youth, and they're not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian, but they also meet the McKinney-Vento eligibility criteria. So these two little boys, for example, were unaccompanied because they weren't in the physical custody of a parent or guardian, and because their housing was not fixed, they were considered McKinney-Vento eligible. For federal data reporting purposes, there are 4 categories to document the student's nighttime residence. And you always want to document the initial eligibility for the student. So if they're in a shelter, then it's a publicly or privately operated facility. And this can be either emergency shelter or transitional housing. Transitional housing can be a little bit confusing because it can be really up to or exceed 2 years. But there are standards for maintaining that housing that create challenges for our families. So for example, you have a case manager who comes by weekly. They make sure that you're actively looking for employment, or there's lots of reasons to get kicked out, basically. And so kids in emergency or transitional shelters count as McKinney-Vento eligible. And that would be the criteria if you have a kid who's maybe in a host home situation, or in one of the very rare youth shelters that we have. One thing to note is that when you're providing services to students in shelters, services need to kick in very quickly because those kids can't stay in that shelter typically for very long. Usually it's between 30 to 60 days, and oftentimes, well, all times really, students are required to get parent permission to remain in the shelter, which is, as you can imagine, a little bit hard to come by. The majority of our kids double up. So the beautiful thing about McKinney-Vento is that it really doesn't matter why the student is homeless. You're just looking at whether or not the housing is fixed, regular, and adequate. So you could have a student, for example, who's run away from home, and maybe the parent tells you or the kid tells you, well, I didn't want to follow their rules. And the cool thing about McKinney is that we serve them anyway. It doesn't matter what our adult perception is about why they're homeless. Just the fact is that they're homeless, and they have all of the rights under McKinney-Vento. So in my experience working with kids, that could mean either, my parents said I can't party in the house and I find that irritating, so I'm going to bolt. Or if I get under a B on my report card, then I get beaten on a daily basis, and I don't like that rule, right? So, it really spans the spectrum. 20 to 40% of all unaccompanied homeless youth report either being or GLBT students who have been kind of kicked out of home because their parents kicked them out. And another 40 to 60% either report physical or sexual abuse as the primary reason that they're not at home. So we just never really know, which is why kind of adult perception of that situation is removed from the equation. Unsheltered kids, these are living situations that are pretty straightforward. And hotels and motels. So kids in hotels and motels aren't typically eligible for HUD-funded housing opportunities because they're considered housed, but for the education definition, they are considered homeless, and so those kids would be coded under hotel motel. So if you look at identified students for the 18-19 school year, and I know the stats that I presented earlier were for the 14-15 school year, but they remain, the identification has gone up, but the housing situations remain relatively static across time. So we've now identified just over 40,000 students, and you can see the identification of unaccompanied homeless youth is relatively low across the state. So oftentimes school districts are not counting these students or not coding them correctly in their student information systems. So they may be identified as homeless, but they forget to check the unaccompanied button. And it's really important for data quality purposes to check both if you have an unaccompanied homeless youth. In addition, if you have a student who's unaccompanied but not homeless, you also need to code them as unaccompanied. Um, we can't drive services in our state towards unaccompanied homeless youth if we don't know how many we're actually working with. And you'll see, based on the pie graph, it's a relatively small piece of the pie currently. I will say that about 15% of all technical assistance inquiries that come into just Ella DeVerse's inbox, who's a program assistant in the homeless education office, are related to unaccompanied homeless youth. And she answers over 6,000 calls or emails a year. So there's a lot. Those students may be unaccompanied or homeless or both, and they should be put in your system accordingly. Homeless unaccompanied youth need to be identified in your student information system, and their separate designations, and they need to be identified even if they don't know it, or even if they don't need anything. So if they don't need services because they live in district, or they have adults who are acting as parents and kind of taking care of their basic needs, you still need to make sure that they're coded in your system. And if a homeless unaccompanied youth is not entered into the system with both classifications, the data doesn't accurately reflect the work that you're doing. And so you have, for my grant, for example, for the Homeless Student Stability Program, I do a competitive grant process, and my grant is required to prioritize districts that are serving unaccompanied homeless youth. And so if you don't code them, and I look at your data after you submit an application, then you actually lose points on the on that component of the grant. So why do you need to do this? Federal law requires school districts to identify unaccompanied homeless youth and report them in your student data system. We have an RCW that's actually in the process of being amended. So right now, school districts that I've identified 10 or more unaccompanied homeless youth during the prior year need to have a building liaison in their middle schools and junior highs and high schools. And there's some primary components around that and district responsibility. However, with the revision of the HSSP legislation, all school buildings, kindergarten through 12 public schools, are going to be required to have a building point of contact. And so that's really the legislature's effort to kind of improve data quality and identification, and also improve services to these particular students. We have an RCW that authorizes school nurses, school counselors, and homeless liaisons to consent for non-emergency outpatient primary care services. So we're not talking about a nip and a tuck. We're talking about you have a student who has a tooth abscess, and so and I don't know if you've ever had an abscess, but it's really hard to pay attention to anything when your face hurts. And homeless liaisons went to the state legislature and said, you know, we have no way to get these kids medical care. And so the legislature passed RCW 770-065, or amended it to allow homeless liaisons to actually consent for non-emergency medical care. And there's a liability clause in there that says that the school district cannot be held liable for signing that consent. And then we have an RCW that requires school districts to facilitate on-time grade level progression and graduation for all students experiencing homelessness, with particular emphasis on unaccompanied homeless youth. And guidance will be coming out shortly on how districts should do that. 2015 marked the reauthorization of McKinney-Vento, which required school districts to grant partial credit to students experiencing homelessness. And our state law tasked in quick succession, kind of telling districts how they needed to do that. And so, in order to ensure eligibility, um, and to make sure that districts are actually providing that service to students, we need them coded in the system. And I was going to say something else, and it totally left my brain.
Didn't land over here.
It didn't. I'm looking at Lisa like, hey, help
It'll
me out.
come back to you in a minute.
Yes.
There we
So
go. So this is where I come in. So the Comprehensive Education Data and Research System, or CEDARS, collects student-level data for all students served in PK through 12 education in Washington. So I'm going to take a step back on here. Everybody participating today is from an LEA, or what we call school district, whether it's charter schools, public school districts. You all operate with a student information system. There's about 10 different vendors in Washington state. All of those vendors, through different means, either they pull the data and send it on your behalf, or someone in your district pulls and submits the data to CEDARS. So when we're talking about this information today, it's what is sent to us. We don't have the ability to go and look in your system. We don't pull your data. This is why it's really important, and why we're talking about this designation and coding today, because it has to be living in your student information system first in the correct areas to be pulled and submitted to CEDARS. So if you have questions about where this data goes that we're talking about and how it lands in CEDARS, I would really encourage you to get hold of your CEDARS district administrator or your student information system coordinator in your school district. If that's not you, I know if we have small districts on board, it's probably them because they wear lots of different hats. If you don't know who that person is and you don't know if you're coding the data in the correct area, you can get hold of me and we'll give you our contact information at the end. I can let you know who in your district is tasked with that responsibility and can help you look at the reports we're going to talk about here and the data pieces to see if we're getting all of the important information about your kids. So that's it. That was my little side road there. So when we talk about CEDARS, it's a state level student information system. When we talk about your system, it's your student information system, or your SIS. So data identifying students as homeless or unaccompanied are submitted to CEDARS. And again, as Jess talked about, these are two unique pieces of data. The element B21 is student homeless comes into our district student file, and valid values are submitted indicating if the student is homeless, and if yes, their primary nighttime residence. Just went through the sheltered, unsheltered, doubled up, and you'll see the valid values in the middle of the screen here. And it's like a flag or a light switch, is how we call it in CEDARS. So if in your system we say Lisa is homeless and she's doubled up, what comes into CEDARS is what we call a valid value of B, saying doubled up, and it's a light switch that gets turned on for a student. Once that student is reported as homeless at any point in time in the school year, we get that fact about that kid for the remainder of the school year. So correct me if I'm wrong on this. Even if a student's shelter or their homeless status changes, they still qualify for services for the remainder of the school year, correct?
that is correct. So you are eligible for the entire time you're homeless and through the remainder of the academic year in which you find permanent housing.
Perfect. That's why we need that yes in there that identifies the student for the rest of the year. And we always hope that situation changes for the kid. But once turned on, once you report that initial status of sheltered, doubled up, unsheltered, or hotels or motels, that's the fact that comes into CEDARS for the remainder of the school year. And again, your SIS system or your vendor works closely with us. They know those pieces. We just don't want you to go in and remove that value for the student once it's in the system. The other piece of information that we collect separately about kids is their status as an unaccompanied youth. That's an attribute about a student. It comes in to our attributes and programs file I, and literally there's a valid value that gets entered into your system. And again, depending on your SIS system, you may have to go and actually type in unaccompanied youth. It might be something in a drop-down menu. Again, I really encourage you to work with your CEDARS folks to make sure the coding's going in the correct area. Once that value is entered, it's the fact that Lisa's an unaccompanied youth or Jess is an unaccompanied youth. This is the date we found out this information. and that data is then submitted to us for the remainder of the school year. And when Jess was talking about it's really important to give us both pieces of this data, my understanding is from our conversations is that unaccompanied youth are, we believe, drastically underreported to us.
That's
In
correct.
some districts. I mean, we're not saying you're all running around not doing your job, but you might be capturing this information in areas that is not getting to us. So we're going to look at some different areas where maybe they can review that data or work with their CEDARS folks to do that. So verify your data submitted to OSPI. And you're like, well, how do we do that? So individuals with access to CEDARS data can review which students have been submitted either as homeless or an unaccompanied youth. The application, which is CEDARS, is found within the Education Data System EDS application. Access to this application requires an EDS login account and password. And if you need any assistance with that, you should hot link the _ district data security manager. Most districts kind of control who gets that CEDARS access. So again, if you are not your CEDARS person, either you have to play nice with them and have a cup of coffee or convince somebody you need the report viewer role in here, or call me and we can, again, identify who that person is. So a lot of you may have access to EDS and not know it. It's what we call the green screen. So if you have a certification in your district and you have to go and review it, or you're responsible for other applications, you may know what that secure login, the green screen is, or EDS, because when you go to the OSPI website, it's like a blue facing page. That's what we call our public page. The green one is the secure login. So you may have access and not know it. So sometimes people are like, oh, I have access and I didn't know it. If you go into EDS, you would click on My Applications or the Applications list. And if you've been given access either as a report viewer or the CEDARS admin, you'll see a link to CEDARS. If you click on that, you'll be taken into the application, and then there's a lot of different reports and accesses that will allow you to view your data by district or school. So up on your screen right now is a snapshot inside CEDARS, the magic land of CEDARS here. And depending on your role, so I want to step back a little bit. If you have access to CEDARS, but you don't see all of these tabs, you may have report viewer only, which will give you less initial tabs across the top. So when you first log in, you'll see if you have full access CEDARS admin, you'll see the home submissions, SSID reports. You won't see that secondary tab below. Once you click on the reports link, the drop-down menu will appear, and then you pick which reports you want to view. So to review the enrollment information for students identified as homeless in your district, you would click on Reports, then Enrollment, and then highlighted in orange is the District Student Attribute Enrollment. And there's drop-down menus that you can see the school year, anything with a little arrow next to it, although it probably just looks like a little dark blip next to the, like for instance, the school year. You can select the current school year or previous school years. It automatically defaults to your school district, where you can drop down and select any of the schools in your district. And then the attribute type. Again, attribute type, what does that mean? There's bits and pieces in here. It's homeless students in here, military family indicator, all the things that come into file D that are just facts about kids. So I would choose from the drop-down menu the homeless students. Unduplicate count. You may not know or care what this is. Some kids in your schools are primary yes, meaning your school has the primary responsibility for the kid. Other kids are primary no. I just recommend clicking on no, because it's going to give you the broader scoop of the kids in your district. And then display student details. You can go for summary details. It's just going to say, yeah, we got some kids. You can't see who they are. But click on student details, and then the business rules that describes exactly how we pull the kids within the system are there. And again, please remember, this is data that's come from your student information system to CEDARS. This allows you to see if we've got all the kids in your district or school, and if not, this is when you go back to your student information system person or your CEDARS person and say, hey, we're missing kids, or there's a lot of kids that are in here that shouldn't be. So this is how we encourage you to look at the homeless students. So this is just a snapshot, assuming you've selected the student level details for the homeless kids. Just gives you an idea of what you're going to see for the kids. See their name, district ID, SSID. This, I'm going to take a little sidetrack again that I don't have a slide on. If you have a question about why is Lisa in here or why isn't Jess in here, and you want to email me or any of us on the contacts we're going to give you, please remember the FERPA rules that we have to follow about protecting kids' identities. If you ever contact us, either just give me the SSID or like the first initial and last name of the kid and their school. Please don't say Lisa Ireland, SSID 1234, identifies as female or gender X, and she's a SPED kid, and we don't need all of these pieces. Kind of be a little cryptic in there because I'm always surprised at the emails we get that just lay out the student's history, and it's not secure. We just want to protect their identity. Right, it's a little soapbox issue.
Yep.
So don't tell everything about the kids in an email. So then if you're like, okay, our homeless data looks great, or now you're panicking and getting hold of somebody in your district, you can also look at who we're getting submitted to CEDARS identified as an unaccompanied youth. So again, you've clicked on the reports link in the top menu. You've got the drop-down menu that you would then go to attributes and programs. Highlighted in orange on the left-hand side, you would click on the dynamic attribute and program report. It's a pretty fancy name for a simple report. Again, you can use your drop-down menu to select year or district or individual schools, and then the attribute or program, you would use the drop-down menu to select unaccompanied youth. You're going to see a laundry list of stuff in there. Title I programs, gifted, LAP, and everything. Just go through it till you find your unaccompanied youth. And I recommend that you click on no or unduplicate count because you're going to get all the kids in your bucket, and then student details. And again, all the business rules applied to create the reports. Anywhere in CEDARS you go to a report, those business rules are going to be there, so you know what to expect. And again, we're just giving you a quick snapshot of the headers you'll see for all of your students. Hopefully, if you have unaccompanied youth, you're going to see a list here. If you don't, and you don't have any kids, then you got some work to do. And this will tell you, again, who the student is, their local district student ID, SSID. I would assume everybody knows what an SSID is. It's a state secure identifier for kids assigned when they're first enrolled and submitted to CEDARS. The federal race roll-up, and then the attributor program. And when the start date, it's not when they started school, it's when they were identified as an unaccompanied youth. And I get a lot of questions from different districts and schools is, do we have to exit the kid every year and re-identify them? No, you don't for CEDARS purposes. If I'm an unaccompanied youth, I was an unaccompanied youth in high school for a couple of years. Once that start date is turned on, you can just keep telling us about that. If your system requires you at the end of every school year to exit kids and re-identify them at the start of a new school year, that's fine. It's a programmatic, issue internally. But we would encourage you then again, if you do exit them at the end of every school year, you have to go back at the start of the year and remember to look at all your kids and get them back into the system. That's usually what we find out is, well, they were in there last year and they don't realize as part of the year-end rollover that they're exited. Just got to go do your due diligence every year. And this data is updated every night. We refresh and we reload CEDARS every night. Now, districts don't necessarily send us data every day. There's a couple larger districts that choose to. Districts are required at a minimum to send us data once a month. Majority of districts send us data once a week, or around times when they're cleaning up the data, like for the McKinney-Vento end of year reporting and stuff, you have the ability to submit it daily. So again, if you were submitting data and you think you should see it in there and you don't, get a hold of us because there's some reasons they may not. They may have aired out or something. But this is really important this time of year when you're getting ready to open the homeless youth reporting to go in and make sure this data is accurate, because if it's not here in CEDARS, it's not going to populate to your McKinney-Vento end of year report. So data submitted to OSPI and CEDARS. I would say, does anybody have any questions? But you guys are good, right? Okay. And we're capturing, do we address that we're capturing all their questions and we'll answer them later?
Yes, and I was just thinking if we get done early, we might be able to visit the Q&A.
Okay.
If we can crank some out.
So data submitted to OSPI and CEDARS to determine, if a student's been submitted correctly as homeless and or unaccompanied youth. You'll need to download both student level reports, kind of do a cross comparison, do a VLOOKUP, do whatever. Hopefully you don't have that many kids that you can't do a pretty quick cross comparison in Excel. Both of those reports we looked at, you can download the data in Excel .txt format, which is kind of a funky name for Excel, or it's .txt, then you can upload it to anything you want, or PDF. I don't know how good PDF would be if you want to sort or cross-reference things, but it's there. If you determine that any of the data submitted for your students is incorrect or missing, either you have kids in there that shouldn't be, because sometimes we'll get information about, hey, these 3 kids were homeless last year and shouldn't be flagged that way this year. So it goes both directions. You'll need to update the data in your student information system and then work with your CEDARS district admin to make sure it gets included in your next submission to CEDARS. Again, once the data comes into CEDARS, within about 24 hours, it should be updated. So again, it's coordinating with them and asking if the submission went in, if it was successful. And again, if you really think all the data is coded accurately and should be included in your system and in your submission, and it's not, have your CEDARS admin get hold of me, and we'll look to see if there's submission exceptions or errors that are occurring that's preventing that data from coming in. Oh, and there we are. So if you want to get hold of us, somebody put my email on there. So you can ask SI at k12.wa.us. To be honest with you, Ask SI comes to my inbox. Why we started this new email for folks that have been in the programs for a long time. For instance, if I'm on the road or the rare day they let me take a day off or have a little vacation or something, I can ask other people. I can assign access to other people. So sometimes you can get a response a little bit quicker. Lisa Ireland, so lisa.ireland at k12.wa.us, or my phone number's on there. That's a direct line to my desk, or customer support. Their contact information's on there. Also, yours on there.
I perhaps just missed it.
Okay, so if you have emails for Jess or anybody in that office, and you send emails to me, I will reach out to them and either get the answer and respond, or I will forward it to the correct people.
Really good questions?
Sure.
Okay, so we will have the PowerPoint available. The webinar is actually being recorded and will be transcribed and posted on the OSPI website. So you'll have access to that, and I'm sure that we can send the PowerPoint out if that would be helpful as well, or we'll put a link under the recorded webinar to the actual PowerPoint. I've been asked to expand on the definition of transitional shelter. Does a 1 or 2 year housing program that is titled as transitional count, basically? And the answer is yes. Transitional, so in a past life, I was a case manager for a transitional housing program. And not only does the law explicitly state that emergency and transitional housing is included in the definition of McKinney-Vento, but there's some pretty practical reasons for that. So as a case manager, what I would do is I would go into someone's home, and we had particular program requirements. So I would go into their home, I would interview them weekly. I would make sure their house was clean, their laundry was done. I would make sure that they were actively seeking employment. I would talk with them about, I was one of those weird ones that's like, hey, are your kids going to school? All of those things that I asked about could potentially be reasons to have a family exit transitional housing. And so 60% of my clients were asked to exit prior to graduating from the transitional housing program. And so it's relatively unstable housing. So there is the explicit requirement to serve kids in emergency and transitional housing is long-term, that's the point. But also there's transitional housing is not overly stable. And so Section 8 vouchers would not qualify because that is stable and consistent, but transitional housing programs that are designed to house people temporarily until they can actually graduate and transition into their own housing is another matter. So can a McKinney-Vento liaison act on an unaccompanied youth's behalf, signing as their parent or guardian to stay in a shelter? The answer is no. The law explicitly states that that has to be a parent or legal guardian. So the challenge is that for many of our youth, that is one of the most significant barriers to remaining in shelter, and the shelter can only keep them for a certain amount of time without parent permission. It's one of the reasons they move around shelter to shelter so much, and also why they would exit before they have a safe and adequate place to stay in the interim. Under the qualifiers fixed, regular, and adequate, does the specific situation have to meet all three criteria? Not necessarily. You could have adequate housing that's not fixed. So in my my little guy's situation, for example, my 6 and 7 year olds, they had adequate housing. They had a bedroom. Unfortunately for them that they shared, they weren't super happy about that. But it wasn't fixed and it wasn't regular because they could have left at any point, and I didn't know how long they were going to be with me. I went through the process of getting third-party custody, but all through that process, they were considered McKinney-Vento eligible because it was really up in the air about whether or not they were going to stay. Most families, by the way, or people who take in kids who aren't theirs, do not go through the third-party custody process because family court is relatively horrible. It creates a whole nother system, and a lot of folks don't want to become legal guardians of kids when they are willing to give them a safe place to stay. I'm going to skip that one.
If we don't answer your question directly today during the webinar, it will be answered later on. It might be more appropriate to answer that one-on-one.
Yes. So there's a question about clarifying how a youth can be unaccompanied but not homeless. So for example, foreign exchange students are unaccompanied by their condition, right? They're coming into the United States specifically to go to school. They come without their parent. Their parent has made arrangements for them to stay within the school district and attend school, that by contract actually. Those kids are unaccompanied, but those students would not be considered homeless because they're not there because they're lacking adequate alternative accommodations. They're there because they're there to go to school.
And I think, Jess, we're going to work on, we have a spring workshop coming up at most of the ESDs across the state. I think Jess and I are going to kind of work on this would be an example of unaccompanied youth and stuff, because there's a lot of scenarios that Jess has shared with me that were, I don't want to say totally caught me off guard, but I think might not be in the arena that a lot of people think about. For instance, if when I was an unaccompanied youth, I was paying rent to stay somewhere, but I was not of legal age, and I wasn't homeless, and I was safe and fine and happy, but I was an unaccompanied youth because there was no parental or guardianship over me. So if we kind of do some of those scenarios and examples, and we'll have like a one-pager that we're going to share out with all the districts at that workshop.
And just for the record, the majority of situations that I've come across in my 20 years of doing homeless education work, there are very rare circumstances when a youth is unaccompanied and not homeless. It does happen, but typically I have 4 teenagers, right? They're 11, well, almost teenagers, but they're like going on 20. So 11, 12, 13, and 14-year-old boys. Teenagers are really hard to live with. I'm not going to lie. It's really hard to live with. Some days I don't want to, right? So I have a commitment and an obligation to those kids. However, there have been circumstances with youth in my home where their behaviors have been such that I have required them to leave. And so there's the stability is questionable. Another example is, there's a young woman who moves in with her boyfriend, right? So her housing And as a grown up, I think, well, she made a decision, right? But her housing is really contingent upon maintaining that relationship. And I don't know, there aren't many people who are in relationships that they were in when they were 16, sometimes, but it's not very likely that that's going to go well. And so we really look at that as a relatively unstable situation.
And just using that example where you have someone living with a partner's family, none of the adults in that home also have legal guardianship and can make decisions for that student, which also is one of the factors, correct?
Yes. So remember that not all homeless students qualify as unaccompanied. You have to be not in the custody of a parent or guardian in order to be unaccompanied, and you have to meet the McKinney-Vento definition of homeless to be considered homeless. If a student is 18 years old, do they need to be identified as an unaccompanied youth? So if that 18-year-old is not with their parent or guardian, then yes. So all of this criteria applies to any student that's eligible to attend public school in Washington State. So in our state, that's up to 21. And so you could have a 20-year-old who is not living with their parent or guardian, but living in a homeless situation and still attending school. They would be an unaccompanied homeless youth for the purposes of data collection and services. Would a student be considered unaccompanied youth if they are staying with a family member with a notarized power of attorney but not any legal court papers? The answer is yes. So I liken this to what we used to do in the old days, where we would write on a napkin that you have the legal authority to care for my child and make educational decisions. If a judge has not granted someone custody, then they do not have custody. There's no alternative process that a person could go through to have true legal authority over somebody else's kid. The question is, what about students living with another family for the purposes of attending a specific school district? So if a family has made previous arrangements and the student is not doubled up because they didn't lose their housing for economic reasons or because they lack other alternative accommodations, then you would. The hard part about McKinney, right, and the beauty of McKinney is that it's really on a case-by-case basis. And so you would look at that. Did they make arrangements, much like a foreign exchange student situation? If there's a relatively formal arrangement for a student to stay with someone else so they can either finish out the school year or attend a particular school, then they would not necessarily be homeless, but you would need to look at the conditions that led them to that. So for example, if a family loses their housing and they move out of the area, but they've arranged for their kid to stay with another family to finish out the school year, then the fact that they lost housing because of an economic hardship issue would in fact qualify that student. So you really have to look a bit deeper in order to understand fully what the situation is.
So let me ask this other question then, looking at that. So if I live in District A, my family owns a home, everything's fine and dandy there, but I want to go to a specific program in District B that's not offered in District A, so I go live with my aunt in my own room, that would not be a homeless student, but might qualify to be unaccompanied?
Correct. They would be unaccompanied because they're not in the custody of a parent or guardian, but they would not be homeless.
Can I answer that one?
Yes.
So there's a question about, do you know where in Skyward the unaccompanied youth information would be entered? At the start of the webinar, we talked about there's about 10 different student information systems in Washington State. Skyward, also known as with SIPSI, is one of them. If you'll contact me, I can help you identify where that information's entered. But also, if you're not your CEDARS person, if you know who that is, they can probably show you. If they don't, again, please contact me either via Ask SI or at my Lisa Ireland email, and I can help you with that.
So there's a question about, is there any kind of paper trail or documentation we have to keep? So your district should be distributing a student housing questionnaire. at a minimum at the beginning of every school year and in every enrollment packet. We really encourage you to do that multiple times a year to remind folks that they can disclose. But those housing questionnaires are a district tool to actively identify. They're not required to provide services or to identify a student. And so you should not delay providing services because the form hasn't been filled out. Identification really needs to be relatively barrier-free for both unaccompanied homeless youth and for families experiencing homelessness. So your liaison is the one person in your school district who has the authority to identify a family as, or an unaccompanied homeless youth as being eligible for McKinney, and you really need to allow them to do that. So their identification for the purposes of any kind of documentation is sufficient. That liaison might actually train other folks in their school district. For example, when I worked in a district, I had building points of contact, which has always been considered best practice. And I trained those building points of contact very specifically on identification. And so while I was responsible for the ultimate determination, my building points of contact actually did the majority of that work for me. They also, by the way, checked with the student information system to make sure that their data was correct, because it was way easier for someone in a building to check on 20 kids than it was for me to check on my 264. So there's a question about students in foster care. So would foster kids be considered unaccompanied? And the answer is no, because when they're in a foster home or a group home, then the person that they're staying with is considered their legal guardian. That person will have a that person will have a placement letter that gives them authority to make day-to-day educational decisions, and that's given to them by the Department of UIF, Department of Children, Youth, and Families. Sorry, I totally blanked on the acronym for a minute. And so the guardianship actually transfers temporarily to the foster parent or caregiver. You could have a student in foster care who is actually living with a relative. So the student's in foster care, but the relative isn't licensed. And those kids would count as foster kids, not as unaccompanied homeless youth. The majority, so DSHS has a program for relatives raising children, and they report an estimated 40,000 kids in Washington State are actually being raised by relatives. And typically those are informal arrangements between family members, typically to avoid putting kids in the foster care system. And so you really need to look at those situations. If you have a 70-year-old woman who's caring for a 5-year-old, first of all, don't create barriers to enrollment, because you should really just give her anything she wants. 5-year-olds are rough, but if there are clues, for example, like, well, you know, I have Johnny until mom gets her stuff together, right? Like you've heard that a lot. Then that's a clue that that is not a fixed or regular situation. Grandma's stepping up so that Johnny doesn't go into the system. And so the majority of situations where relatives are caring for kids are actually homeless situations, and all of those kids would be coded as unaccompanied. For unaccompanied youth, would this include students who are attending school under a hold harmless agreement? I'm going to ask you to actually expand on your question at some point, or email me directly, because I don't know what that means.
And again, if we don't answer your question due to time limitations, my understanding is all of these will be answered, compiled, and answered, and posted along with the webinar, correct?
Yes.
So there's a question: when a homeless, unaccompanied youth returns home, do they remain categorized unaccompanied for the remainder of the year, or do we record an end date? That's a great question. The homeless flag or light switch stays on and is submitted for the remainder of the year. But if it's determined the student is no longer unaccompanied, you provide an exit date for that, but you continue submitting that data about the fact student was unaccompanied at some point in time during the school year. And when we pull data, we'll look at dates, and most of the time we'll just include them in that bucket per se when we're counting this unaccompanied. It's really just a fact of how we collect the data in Cedars.
And it's there are particular rights that go along with being an unaccompanied homeless youth, as far as like you can enroll yourself in school, and you can you need accommodations as far as being able to figure out a way to excuse absences, and there you're often staying with a family who's acting as parent. Therefore, under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, they can have access to your student records. So there's lots of things that are in place for unaccompanied youth that are not necessarily in place for homeless youth. And so being able to turn on and off that flag on and off is critically important to school staff, who will need to know kind of what their current status is. So a child being removed from CPS, are they considered similar to foster care? The answer is yes, because Department of Children, Youth, and Families has placement and care authority. So in public schools, we recognize any student who is part of the dependency process as being in foster care if they're placed outside the home 24 hours per day away from a parent or guardian. So if a student is, for example, in what we call shelter care status, which no normal people know what that means, but it means that basically the court has removed the child, but they don't know if they're going to stay in care. So if they're in that status, they're considered in foster care because it's been determined that they can't be at home, and the state is making that decision. So yes, they meet the definition of a student in foster care because they're in 24-hour per day away from their parents' placement. So foster kids are not unaccompanied, nor are they homeless. So they should not be coded. In 2015, McKinney-Vento was reauthorized, and awaiting foster care was removed from McKinney-Vento. So your school district should have a foster care liaison who's been designated. It's one of the federal requirements under the Every Student Succeeds Act. And they have so they're eligible for McKinney-like services for the entire time they're in foster care now, so not just kind of that first initial placement. So they should not be coded as homeless. So please remember that students in foster care are coded as foster care students, and we actually push data out to the school districts to let you know who your kids in foster care are. They have a data sharing agreement through DCYF that allows us to do that. So we're talking about students who are not in foster care who meet the McKinney-Vento definition of homeless, and not students in foster care.
Questions in Q&A with the chat log, right?
Where's the chat log?
Okay. Hang on just a sec. Technical difficulties. If you go up here, so this drops down.
Can I close this?
Yeah. Over here, where it says more.
Oh my goodness. There's more. But
you
wait,
are so
there's
popular.
more.
But wait, there's more. Yeah. We may have already answered some.
So one of the things I was going to talk about, the question is, so what current services do unaccompanied youth qualify for? So they qualify for all the same services that students experiencing homelessness would qualify for. And so 12th grade is one of the grades where we identify the most kids, and it's really important if you have a 12th grader who's graduating, who's an unaccompanied homeless youth, to code them as such and to identify them. And there are lots of reasons for that, but primarily there are two really cool things that happen for them. So if they're unaccompanied homeless youth in the year that they fill out the FAFSA, and you've identified them, and provide a letter, we have a letter template on the OSPI, Homeless Education website, then they can claim independent status for the purposes of their FAFSA, which means that they typically will get the maximum amount of federal aid. The other thing is the legislature last year passed Senate Bill 6274, called Passport to Careers, which makes unaccompanied homeless youth eligible for state need grants and scholarships comparable to what we currently offer students in foster care. So what that means is that the state need grant is essentially designed to make up the space in between what they would get in federal aid and what it costs them to actually attend school. And so we have the ability to actually look at kids and say, you can graduate from college with little to no debt. And that is a really powerful tool for providing hope for kids. A lot of the kids that I work with are actually much smarter than I was when I was that age. They don't want to take out student loans. They don't want to borrow. Because they've seen debt destroy their families. And so it's a very powerful tool to be able to say, look, this is a cool thing. If you want to read the bill, it's Substitute Senate Bill 6274. And it's actually one of the coolest things I've ever read, I will say. So when I say accessing services through the remainder of the school year, what are you referring to? What I'm referring to are all of the services available to McKinney-Vento students. So they're categorically eligible for Title I, regardless of whether or not they score below standard on any of our kind of standard measures. They're eligible. So you could have an AP history student, for example, who's really struggling because they're experiencing homelessness, and Title I can be used to help kind of mitigate the impact of that. Of their homelessness. They're categorically eligible for free meals, which means that from the date they're identified through 30 days into the next school year, they can have free breakfast and lunch, and that process needs to be barrier-free. They are eligible for school of origin transportation if, for example, they're couch surfing and sometimes they move or they do move outside of that school's catchment area. The school district needs to facilitate school of origin attendance, retention, and academic success. They're also eligible for things like fee waivers and school district support if they have barriers around, for example, if they're participating in CTE classes and they can't afford the shop fee or the art fee or the instrument rental, then the school district would be required to help kind of remove those barriers to full participation. And there's also ways that we need to help mitigate the impacts of just kind of being on your own. So for example, we were looking at attendance data yesterday in a data dive meeting, and we looked at truancy rates. So truancy petitions for homeless students are filed kind of at exponential rates. And part of the reason why is because unaccompanied homeless youth aren't provided the opportunity to actually have absences excused. So there are a lot of services that are available for kids that we need to really kick into gear. And Lisa's telling me I'm out of time.
Yeah, these are great questions, though, and I love the fact that people are thinking very deeply about this and kind of peeling the layers on the onion, I guess, as we say. And as just at the start, we're going to be downloading the chat and the questions, providing answers to these. If they're not answered sufficiently, please reach out to us. Not that anybody would ever say you would answer questions, insufficiently. But if it leads to more questions, please keep asking them, because we really need you to fully understand the implications about these kids and getting the correct data into us.
And this is the best way for us to facilitate help to districts. We need to know how many kids you're working with, and that allows us to leverage resources for services for a really hard population to serve. So thank you so much. We appreciate your time. Please let us know if you have additional questions.
Thanks, everyone.